Dr. Awolabi from the Interdisciplinary Studies. That's a new department here on campus. Right now they are developing a letter of intent for the central office in City University to initiate a new department and a new career program on the bachelor's level. Assistant Provost Doris Withers, she's from the Office of Academic Affairs and was a former member of the biology program here on campus. She's a biologist. Dr. Sheila Mayers-Johnson, also with the Interdisciplinary Studies Department and teaches with the Psychology Department and is initiating a new course in American Psychology. Dr. Ralston Grant, I think you met here this morning, the Dean from Business and College Administration. Professor Barbara Day is with us this semester. She's a journalist and she's with the literature. This is Barbara. And did I miss that? Well, you met Youssef. And some of the students, I'm sorry I don't, that are here. Why don't you introduce yourselves? Because
Peter Byers, psychology major, work in social science and behavioral sciences department.
Victoria Awolabi, nursing major.
Sorry?
Victoria Awolabi, nursing major. I work with the Evolution Department.
okay, Gilda is the director.
I'm Gilda Pugh. I work here in the academic research.
I'm Celia Saron. I'm an education major. I work here. I always go to Cornell.
Which school?
She goes to the biochemistry. Chemistry.
For those of you who weren't able to join us in the auditorium, I want to publicly thank Youssef Nuruddin for inviting Dr. Bernal to visit the campus today. He came on very short notice. And as I said in the auditorium, I hope this is just the beginning or a continuation of a dialogue that's been started down here in the School of Liberal Arts and Education. And Youssef, thank you very much for making all the arrangements and everything.
Well, I wasn't thinking in terms of presentation yet.
No, this is informal conversation.
I have various things that I've written, and some of these are responses to articles that have been circulated around Lanesburg, let's say. And so I thought that might be interesting to people. And the copies of an article that I wrote on the origins of Western science. I mean, I'm afraid they're not equal numbers of copies.
Are you ready to receive a question?
Sure.
You will facilitate my getting access to a copy of what you got? Thank you.
Yes.
Actually, we could see the additional copies of
We can open the floor for questions.
Would you, I'd like to just set up a stage here for you before I ask my question. What sort of analysis would you give to the Bengalese Empire set up along the Ganges River, as compared to the construction in the Nile Valley?
Well, I think that more the Indus Valley rather than the Ganges Valley is clearly a very old civilization. Was it the language was pretty clearly Dravidian, that is like the present South Indian. And those people were black in an Indian way. I mean, that's when the Greeks referred to two sets of Ethiopians. They referred to these people as well. And it was an irrigating civilization and was crushed, I think, in a rather old-fashioned way. It was crushed by the Aryan invaders. In India, I think there really was an Aryan model. But in Greece, I can't see any evidence for it. I don't think. Sometimes barbarians from the north do come in and overwhelm existing societies, and that's what I think happens, the Indus River civilization. Yeah.
I promised you I would ask this question. One of the resources I read at the Africana Resource Center was a collection of articles written by women in the Journal of Women's History that were critiquing the book. And from my point of view, I thought some of the comments that Gerda Lerner made were most interesting, and I wanted to know if you could comment on them. One, she raised the question of, one, why you titled the book Black Athena, especially since you wanted to make a contribution around the issue of race and racism. And she argued that by naming it Black Athena as opposed to African Athena, you sort of fell into your own trap. And I wondered, one, if you would comment on that for us, and perhaps on the use of, the use of the concept of race for us as a useful tool for educators. And two, if you would comment on the critique that was made that you're just, it's a long answer, of course, but you're discussing the origins of ancient civilizations without bringing in the issue of gender, which is very important for historians.
Well, I think on the first, the choice of Athena was because I felt there were particularly neat etymological, iconographic, and historical reasons one could link the goddess Neat to Athena. It's one of the titles. I mean, there are others equally titled. But there was something generally subversive which appealed to me in the idea of a black woman being the divinity of warfare and wisdom and weaving. I mean, and that, therefore, the general radical intent of the book was put out in that way. In a way, maybe it would be better to say Black Zeus, which the book title has already been used. But Zeus comes from Ammon, who was a South Egyptian god or a Nubian god, whereas Neat tended to be in the Delta, although not always, I would have thought. On the Black African issue, whether it should be Black Athena or African Athena, it was really this question of semantic shading. I mean, that black to white readers meant West African, and therefore I was slightly uneasy with it, so I say I prefer African, because I have no doubt about the African nature of Athena, and not merely Egyptian in this case, because Athena was also a Libyan goddess. Neat was a Libyan goddess, and that is explained by Herodotus, so that it was not one African culture, but two. But it has led to confusion, and putting it on the women's shelves in some bookstores, things like that. You open the book. Now, on the substantive thing, why no gender? Because two of the societies were viciously patriarchal. I mean, the Western Semitic society and the Greek society. And maybe I should have made more about the relative power of Egyptian women, which in a way preserved the status that women had had all over Southwest Asia in the third millennium. And I should have brought that in more. And I also probably, in the historiography, should have brought in the gender implications of the Northern invasion, which is very much seen as masculinity triumphing over femininity. And I think that the imagery of white, pure masculinity and dark femininity was very important. I think I do mention that, actually, when we're talking about Gobineau, for instance, so that does come in. But what I couldn't see is what a number of feminist ancient historians have done, which is to see the matriarchies before. Now, in volume 2, I accept the work of Lucy Goodison on Minoan religion in the third millennium, before the Palaces, where she sees a lot of signs of the importance of women and female deities. And the interesting thing that women, the goddess of the sun was seen as female, which goes against the whole Aryan imagery of the sky as masculine and the earth as feminine, the sky being on top. But here you have a female sun. So I do touch on it in volume 2, but in volume 1 I don't. I think her criticism is absolutely legitimate. So do you answer other questions? No, okay.
How is it that your model research, you did a vast amount of research, and you acted as though you were unfamiliar with the work that was done by the UNESCO, the General History of Africa, which resulted in 8 volumes plus 12 volumes, supplementary volumes of data, and the Cairo Symposium, where Dio Honobenga and many of the your major archaeologists and ancient historians and classicists and linguists, they were all there for that great debate, and yet you seem to have been totally unaware of it. Of course, I know that it was hardly covered in the press here in the United States, but it was pretty well known among black historians, African historians, African scholars. They kept up with it, and the annex to volume 2 of that volume history, it's there. Yet you never made any mention of it because it's in there where they have presented scientific evidence, not opinion, and not the views of Herodotus, but his own science, and you know he was a scientist, his own scientific findings, which generally...
My cousin, actually, I'll explain what I mean.
Okay.
But no, go on.
Which generally was accepted, especially in the area of linguistics. And specimens from mummies, numerous specimens, and even when a white person was found as a mummy, it could have been explained because you who are familiar with the history of Western Asia, at a certain point, Egyptian pharaohs, for reasons of state, they would marry Western Asian princesses and bring them into Egypt. This became very, very common.
They did his mother, I think.
All right, they did this. That didn't make Egypt Semitic or Western Asian, especially when loan words were shown, as you show several the loan words in the Greek vocabulary. Diop was doing the same thing you did to show loan words in Egyptian vocabulary, that they came from outside, and because of mixing and intermingling of peoples, but the evidence were very, very clear who the Egyptians were. And Champollion had done this in 1820. If you remember, when he his brother and other Europeans rejected it, I think he gives some of the most conclusive evidence of who the ancient Egyptians were. One won't have to even deal with Herodotus, although he tells you about 3 or 4 times in book 2 of his history who the Egyptians were.
Okay, and this is really backing up the criticism you quote from Basil Davidson of my work. Now, there are 2 levels of defense. One is what I tried to go is that my concern initially was Egypt to Greece, not the relationship of Egypt with the rest of Africa.
Yeah.
And so that I didn't really go into that in the same depth, or no, I didn't go into it. I mean, I won't claim any significant depth, and it's only with this sort of ensuing debate that I've really started going into that. The second is it shows the isolation of African scholarship from classical scholarship, that I was working away without any notion of the Nile Valley School until 8 years old. It's funny, I knew Jim Turner. I mean, I was seeing him. I knew Loxley Edmondson. I knew the various people that in the Africana Center, and somehow they didn't mention it to me. I didn't know anything about Van Setterman's work until 8 years on into my research. Jim said, well, why don't you go to the conference in Atlanta? So they very generously gave me a period at the end of the conference to talk about it, and that's where I met all the people for the first time. And then afterwards at Cornell I met Dr. Bain, and so I got to know the people in that world. So that chapter 10 in my work in a way looks like an afterthought, and in a way is, because it was a later addition to what I had done. I then found I had learned a great deal. I was very excited intellectually by that conference, particularly by Van Setterman, who I was extraordinarily impressed by, and I find his work on America absolutely convincing. I have no problem with that at all. So that, but it wasn't my focus. I do then the end of the book I talk about where I stand in the population of Egypt, and I still see it as a Northeast African population, and that there are blacks, but same with Senegal, is a very mixed population.
But you overlook something here. You mentioned, I think it's also in volume 1. You talk about the Afro-Asiatic and that area in East Africa, that area in East Africa, where mankind was supposed to have evolved. Mm-hmm. And although you said, to be honest, you said that you didn't have the evidence to support it in volume 1, I found it strange that you're talking about an Afro-Asiatic population in ancient Africa. And I asked myself, where did this Asiatic population come from? Because if Africa, the continent, is the cradle of mankind, it took them tens of thousands of years to migrate out of the continent into different areas. Apart from Greenberg's argument about the Afro-Asiatic root of certain languages and so forth and so on, Leakey and what's the name, Sonia Cole, who was a student of Leakey, as you well know. I mean, they have done it. I mean, they did the major work on paleontology in that region, and there is no discussion in anywhere in their work about Afro-Asiatic people there. And the only time I saw it is when you talked about it in that part of Africa, and I was puzzled because.
Can I come in?
Yes, please.
I see the Afro-Asiatic language family loosely connected to a people as having started in the Rift Valley or in that area in southern Ethiopia, northern Kenya. And there's nothing Asiatic about it at that stage. It later spreads into Asia, the Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic family.
But the Asiatic part, where does it come from?
It comes from the fact that some people from this originally African language family moved to Asia.
And then came back into Africa?
Well, to the extent that Arabic is a Asiatic
But that's 639, 700 if you're talking about the Arabs in Africa, 639, 700.
And there's not a question of what's happening in Ethiopia, because I think the basic movement of population was from Ethiopia into Arabia, across the Bab el-Mandeb. But there have been times when South Arabian kingdoms were in contact with Ethiopia,
yes.
Although just before the period of the Islamic era, you get the Ethiopians actually conquering South Arabia.
Quite
I mean, knowing that. So you have that, but you have to explain. I'm not saying...
Okay, so that's the period you're talking about?
No. What I'm talking, I mean, I think there are three periods. First of all, human origins do seem to be East African. I mean, we're now talking millions of years ago, or 2 million years ago. The Afro-Asiatic language family, I believe, starts about 10,000 BC, something like that. Much, much later. We're talking, just later time scales.
Yes.
But it's an African language family. It's called Afro-Asiatic because one branch moved to Asia, not because it was Asians in Africa to begin with.
Okay.
So that it,
okay. That's okay. All right. Good. Clarity. Okay. Just one other note. I wrote my article back in 1992 in response to Professor Lefkowitz. Mm-hmm. At the time when I wrote the piece, I was unaware that there was a debate raging at Wellesley between myself and Tony Martin. I was unaware of this debate. I reacted to the piece in the New Republic, if you remember, that's where it was originally published. And some friends of mine, came to see me and said, look, why don't you respond to this? We can't take this line down. I said, okay, and I wrote the piece which apparently you have read. And sent it to numerous publications. Nobody wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole, including the New Republic. They said, what? They told me, they wrote me back. They refused to respond. And then my friends started calling them on the telephone. Then they responded with a letter saying they do not publish unsolicited manuscript. In other words, they allow Lefkowitz space in the New Republic to attack Afrocentric scholarship, but Afrocentric scholarship, unless they created their own journals and magazines, had no way of responding to Lefkowitz. It's in there while responding to Lefkowitz that I dealt with you also, and volume 1 by looking at what Davidson had to say about about the scholarship.
They did accept my response to Mary Lefkowitz.
Yes.
Which some of you may have. I mean, there's a copy. That's my. You can borrow it. This one I need to send back. I'll copy which again shows their basic racism. They took mine, they didn't take yours. But there is a line there. I think we should take them both. I don't think you should have bumped me, but that's been in there. And then she responded, and they didn't publish my response to her response.
They didn't publish it?
They published my response, but not my response to her response, which is also one of the typescripts on one of the things is my response to her response. And some of you may have that. I wasn't aware of the Tony Martin issue either at all. And then she wrote a large piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I don't know if you saw that.
I read it, yes, I have.
Yep. So I wrote a fairly long response to that, which I'm afraid I didn't bring here. And that was published. And she didn't respond to me then, but she invited me to Wellesley. And I felt obliged to go and curious. I mean, who is this woman? What is she doing? She has, I've discovered within classics, a great reputation for unscrupulousness. And she saw herself as the scourge of feminism, was what she was doing before. She was attacking Afrocentrism in this area. And we had, I spent time with her and with Selwyn Cudjoe, who was there. But I didn't see Tony Martin, who I wanted to meet. And the only issue that I heard about at that time was no, I didn't even hear about it then, I heard about it 6 months later, was the issue of Dr. Ben's class, Dr. Ben's lecture, and Hugh Lloyd-Jones got up and said, this is all nonsense. And some of the students were offended and said, you're insulting Dr. Ben. And Hugh Lloyd-Jones and Mary Lefkowitz thought this was outrageous, that they should be treated in this way. That issue I'd heard about. I hadn't heard about the Nation of Islam's book, Secret Relationship, and that whole thing. I don't know quite when that happened. I don't know quite what the time sequence is. But the irony is that Mary Lefkowitz is hardly, she is trying to escape from being Jewish rather than being Jewish or Zionist.
She's trying to escape, you said?
Yeah. But she married a pillar of the English Goy establishment, Sir Hugh Lloyd-Jones. And she took up classics. So although, and she's very eager to point out that her real name is Lefkowitz, it's some German name, and they're German Jewish, and they're really assimilated.
She described herself as Caucasian.
Yeah, that she do, which is, and so I'm not quite sure. I think there are two issues going on, which I think Tony Martin rather conflated. I think Mary Lefkowitz, as I've been fighting, you and I, we've both been fighting Mary Lefkowitz on one issue, but I don't think that's the same as the Nation of Islam and the Hillel students getting after Tony Martin on his using that book.
That's a
different
related, but
it's a different issue. But it'd be interesting because I'm going to teach the Nation of Islam book.
You want to teach it?
With refutations, yeah. Coming up next semester with refutations. So we'll see what happens.
I'd like to raise a different kind of question, kind of cut down this dialogue.
Sorry, yeah.
In view of your allusion to evolving multicultural society, in your opinion, whose interest or what interest should the future of education serve?
Well, it's difficult, but it should serve all Americans. And the narrowness of the canon and the thing has got to be broadened. The issue of whether one should have a single coherent body of knowledge taught to everybody, or whether one should have different bodies of knowledge taught to different sections of the American population is a little difficult. My feeling is it should be overlapping and not have a compromise on that issue. There should be some common, but some specific to particular groups.
But it should be unified to some extent.
It should to some extent be unifying, but you can't teach everybody about everything, and I think the particular groups. I think it's difficult because, if you're teaching black studies, African American studies, then do you have to have a segment on Caribbean, on West Africa, East Africa, and there are so many different aspects, or take an extreme example, should people be taught Samoan culture as opposed to Asian American? There are limits of feasibility into how many cultures you can really put in the general curriculum. But I think that every American should know something about the black experience. And I think one thing that Tony Martin was absolutely right is I'm all for there being a Holocaust museum in Washington, but it's outrageous there is no museum of slavery. I mean, it seems to me that this sort of general education should be made available or more, I mean, of course, for all Americans to confront, wherever they come from. On the other hand, I think that black students should learn about the Asian American experience, things like that, which are not taught. So it's, I'm sorry, I'm being very wishy-washy on this, but I think there should be some common core, but there should be specific areas for particular groups.
So how have the Egyptians reacted to it? Because I would think they would be very much interested in what is being said about their ancestors, even though there might not be a direct link between the present and those ones, but still, they could observe the Egyptians, I'm sure they would react. In addition to that, I have seen some writings in Arabic, like in Sharq al-Awsat and Al-Haram and others, where I think soon after your book came out, they were talking about Egypt is neither black nor this. Egypt is, Arabic. It's not white, it's not black, it's Arabic, and so on. Did you get any kind of feedback from the Middle East?
I mean, that there was a stage when they were wanting to invite me to Khartoum, but then I was called by the ambassador, but then it somehow, perhaps some of my radical Sudanese friends told me, don't deal with him, so it's complicated issues. But on the other hand, what's it called? Al-Hayat?
Al-Hayat, yes.
Al-Hayat had a couple of very favorable reviews of me and attacking my critics. But I think the upper class Egyptians don't like what I'm saying. I mean, they like the Egypt into Greece, that's fine. But the connection with the rest of Africa is something they don't want to think about. I don't know if any of you have seen the film.
Why not?
Because they've accepted the color code of the West.
Is that the only reason?
Well, it's the essential reason. I think there's another aspect, which is Islam's ambivalence towards pre-Islamic Egypt and Pharaoh as a symbol of worldly decadence, in a way, power and decadence. So I think most Egyptians still have pride in pharaonic Egypt. But the fact that pharaonic Egypt was used by Western powers as a tool for controlling Egypt makes some ambiguity among it. But I think the attack on tourists is partly hitting the purse of the government in Egypt, but it's also tourists coming to see the pharaoh.
If I may continue, there is also a general feeling in the Islamic world, as you know, that there has always been this anti-West sentiment. And when they see probably that this might begin to reflect itself in the Islamic teachings and so on, they would probably begin to resist these kinds of ideas from spreading, because they've always held the fact that if we become contemporary now and look, for instance, at what is happening in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and so on, most of the indecisions that we see, many people from the Islamic world attribute that not because of reality-based decisions, but basic anti-Islamic, anti-Islamic world.
Common market. Yeah, no, I think that's a widespread perception. I mean, I'm not quite sure to what extent that particular case is true, because Western powers are very reluctant to intervene to help Bulgarians against Turks and things like that, but you have a lot of difficulty. But I'm sure being Muslim doesn't help the process that way.
I think also, I concur with you in relation to just the color line, especially in Egypt, around Muslims, this whole area of Islam, that it's definitely a class issue. And class is tied into color, direct relation to color. During the Napoleon era, when the whole onslaught of the European invasion comes into Egypt, and you had the whole issue of the king, I can't recall which king it was, but he paid black Egyptians at that time to marry the white Mamluks to lighten the color of the Egyptians. This is in Egyptian history, I'm sure. So again, here you're trying to juxtapose yourself with the white expansion of Europe, which again relates to the color line. So
Yeah, but I think it's very old in Egypt. I mean, I think since the Persian period, and some of the most horrific examples of color prejudice and self-hatred by blacks come from Coptic Egypt.
Well, there's a deeper issue here. If you remember when Chancellor Williams wrote on the destruction of African civilization, the book was attacked in the Algerian press back then when it was published, okay? When Diop began a lot of his writings, he was specifically and pointedly asked what should happen in the because Diop began calling for a continental federated African state, which I believe you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And he was asked, well, what about the Arabs? He said, well, you know, because the question, part of the question was that the Arabs were also a conquering force on the African continent, and they occupy large chunks of African land, including Egypt. What is going to be done about them? And his response was, well, we will ask the Arabs to join us in this new political structure we want to set up. And he said, the question was, and if they refuse? And Diop said, well, they can't blame us. At least we asked them. So this is a larger and deeper unanswered question when the question comes up. It's not just a question of color and the Arabs and Arabic language and Islam, but the question is, you know, it's hypocritical on the one hand to attack Europe and European conquest and colonialism on the African continent. But the Arabs were also conquerors much earlier, starting in 639, all of North Africa. It's African land, and they're there, and the questions sooner or later have to be addressed. So to me, when one talk about classical scholarship, and Egypt comes into it, especially present day, I call it Arab Egypt, with the majority of Egyptians in the south who are Africans, they are blacks, and they are related, they are the descendants. In fact, Diop makes this argument. They're the descendants of the original Egyptian, and it's difficult to dispute that. But the questions, they're not mutually exclusive between the issue of conquest and occupation and land, and the question of the African contribution to world civilization.
I mean, I think the class issue in Egypt is very important.
It is important.
The Fellahim
It's fundamentally important, yes.
And they have a lot of old Egyptian words in their vocabulary, in their everyday vocabulary. These are Muslims, these are not Copts who have the Coptic as their religious language. So I think there really is continuity. And in fact, Copts tend to be lighter than non-Copts in Egypt, which I think is a question of who's converted, because Islam is a great social liberator, and people who turn to Islam would tend to be poorer, and in a way, so I think that the lighter upper classes of pre-Islamic Egypt tended to stay with Christianity.
Yeah, well, I like to recast the whole question of the history in a multicultural sense again, because that's what I'm most interested in. It seems as though that most times when a question is asked, what is to be taught in a multicultural curriculum, people tend to scuttle away. They never want to answer that. But as a historian, would you say that along the continuum of history, there are certain very important civilizations, there are certain very important epochs that all of us need to know about?
Yes, I think there are, and I think that people should not be European provincials. They should really know about Egypt, they should know about China, they should know about India. There are certain big ones that everybody ought to know about. And also not just to know about the discrete entities, which world history books are tending to do now, they have section 1 and 2, but to see its relations. And the role, in particular, of these civilizations in the formation of Europe. I think that is very important. Yeah, I think everyone should know that. Yes.
Because in Black Athena, chapter 1, chapter 10, Okay, you find the whole chapter based on two stories. Said about the happy end. You talk about how the Jews become a scholar.
Sorry, how?
How
Jews.
Jews yeah, scholars. Then the second story tell about the United States of African Asian and of Egyptian Asian. But in one of the chapter 2, we talk about how the Alexander the Great and Aristotle land in Egypt, even to follow them to their worshipping courts in order to get the education. But at the end of that chapter, I couldn't say clearly the contribution of African and Egyptian and African to the Western civilization.
Well, I mean, this is, volume 1 is essentially on the writing of history. I mean, volumes 2 and 3 will be dealing with more, or volume 2 does more. But what I do in chapter 1, not chapter 2, is to say the way in which Greek writers interpreted Egypt and how they were impressed by it and they were moved by it. But essentially, I was looking at the images of Egypt rather than contributions. I mean, there are other things, for instance, the booklet here, and the article, Animadversions on the Origins of Greek Science, where I talk and I use Job as one of the basis for this, on the contribution of Egyptian science and mathematics to Greek science and mathematics. So there are, and I refer to it, but basically I'm looking at the images of ancient Egypt among the Greeks. I mean, I don't spell out the story about Egyptian sculpture going into Greek sculpture and things like that. Some of that will come in other volumes. Yes?
A different kind of question. I'm not a historian. I'm enjoying the dialogue, that of which I can understand, I can follow it, but I don't have in-depth understanding. But I'm really curious to know something about how you came to this area of study, because I've noticed with great interest that you're in the Department of Government. As a faculty person at Cornell, in the Department of Government, how did you get there, and how comfortably do you sit there with this kind of academics?
Well, my basic topic, I mean, what I did my thesis in and taught for 20 years was Chinese intellectual history and modern politics. So I was hired by the Department of Government at Cornell to teach Chinese and to some extent Vietnamese politics. So it's a very different thing. I then had a midlife crisis. I worked, and I described this in the introduction, so I tried to sort of level with people what was happening. And I started looking at the role of the Phoenicians in the formation of Greece. I started just on the Semitic side as a hobby. I mean, the mistake of the establishment was giving me tenure too young, when I still had some mental flexibility. And teaching in an Ivy League college, I wasn't crushed by the load. And at that stage, Chinese politics was very easy to teach because all the old guys were still there, and you teach the same people from 1936 to 1976, and it was all. So I had time. And I was also in a student house. I was living in a student house, which is an intellectual fraternity, in which there were two characters who might be known to you. One was Alan Bloom, who had been there for 2 years before. And one of the students was young Frank Fukuyama. So I met intelligent right-wingers, which is a thing I've never encountered before in my life, and never thought I would encounter. But it's oxymoron. It's really very difficult. And what I realized, talking to the people who've been influenced by Bloom, was how he was using a German romantic image of Greece for extremely right-wing purposes. Now, in Cambridge, I was surrounded by classicists I met all the time, and they were dear, sweet, liberal people in their personal beliefs, and their attraction to democratic Athens and things like that was entirely fitted with that, congruent with it. But then I realized that this use of Greece in this right-wing and racist way, really alerted me to its significance, what I should, and I started looking into it. And part of Bloom's line was a sort of mystic, or Leo Strauss, who took it from, was that there had been only two people in the world count, peoples in the world count, the Aryans, or the Europeans, represented by the Greeks, and the Semites, represented by the Jews. And they come together just before Christianity, and then that is what makes the magic of Western civilization. And then it was that marriage that made it. Well, I came to the conclusion that they'd been fooling around long before them, and that there were contacts much earlier. And I was led to a school which was arguing for this, and which had been thoroughly persecuted by Orthodox classicists. A number of Semitists had been saying, look, there are great similarities across the line. So for a time, I was purely working on Phoenician influences on Greece, and becoming convinced that it wasn't only intricate mythological parallels, but also linguistic, that I was learning Hebrew for the first time, and finding that their words were very similar to Greek, and that sort of got me going on that. But there was still a gap. I knew 40% of Greek vocabulary was Indo-European, 20-25% was Semitic, and the rest I assumed was pre-Hellenic. I accepted the basic Aryan model, although I looked for others. And then one day, I mean, some of you have seen this in the film, I was in a bookstore and I saw an etymological dictionary of Coptic, which tempted me. I mean, I'm a sort of language junkie. Not that I'm serious or good at languages, but I love beginning and stuff. So I picked this up, and I suddenly realized that some of the words that I hadn't been able to solve were very evident in late Egyptian, because Coptic, as is written with an alphabet, gives you some of the vocalizations of Egyptian, and it suddenly made sense. And that led to two revelations. One was I thought this will explain some of the missing 30%. But also, what was the taboo that had prevented me from looking towards Egypt? And this was particularly acute in my case because my grandfather was an Egyptologist. He wrote the standard grammar of ancient Egyptian. And I had been fascinated with Egypt, but it had always been other. It had always been exotic, different, separate, nothing to do. And so that this separation and my refusal to see how Greece could be related to Egypt struck me as an important ideological thing. So then I started working on the historiography as well as on the Egyptian linguistic side. So that was the how I really got going in that way. And then I produced a manuscript which was 800 pages long, and I tried to hawk it rather than said this talk, and nobody was interested, or nobody wanted to know, until I had this old friend of mine who said he wanted it and published it. But then when I revised it for him, each of the sections doubled or tripled in length, so obviously couldn't be held in one book, so that's why it's a series of books.
One more question that really is a fascinating life of the mind, scholarly pursuit. Enjoy hearing that. But this is a different kind of question coming from a curriculum biologist type. I hear you discussing science. One of the things that happens many times on campuses when they're talking about multicultural approaches, core curricula, those kinds of things, the faculty talk about infusing this across disciplines. And one of the difficulties that many folk in science say is the case, that there is nothing about science or very little, unless you do it artificially, that you could present to a student that would contribute to the multicultural part of the curriculum from the science perspective. So, I'm sure you're aware, it's common, science is science.
Very well science, and it happens to be European.
Yes, yes. And that...
And male.
There is, yes, yes.
Sorry to interject.
And less so now male than,
But not appreciative.
Not appreciably so. Okay.
Hard science is physics
Hard science
and old geology.
Yes. But Are there things that you could direct us to or share with us that might be useful for persons who are teaching science for non-majors as well as majors that might be useful to either infuse in the curriculum through supplementary readings or through something that might enrich the regular presentation of the hard subject matter?
I don't know if any of you saw the film about the Latino teacher of math.
Yes, I did. Yes.
And one of the first things he said was, trying to get the concept of zero across. He said the Romans didn't have zero, the Greeks didn't have zero, the Mayas had zero, you have zero in your blood. Well, I was pushing racism a bit far, but I think that had a really, it was an important teaching tool, but they weren't alienated from science. That by not being Anglos, that didn't mean that they were unrelated. And therefore, I think that scientists may consider it artificial to talk about Egyptian mathematics. But it seems to me crucial, and I think Beatrice Lumpkin and people like that have done interesting work, because one of the tragedies, when I said Malcolm X didn't say enough, it's not that whites taught blacks, to hate themselves, or hate themselves, but also to despise, to say that it becomes un-black to be mathematical or to be scientific, and to show that African people were highly analytical. I think the analytical tradition in Europe starts in Egypt. Mummification is cutting things apart, separating them, seeing their functions. The same with this, that was the main myth in Egyptian mythology. It is the dismemberment of Osiris and the reassembling, or the fraction of the eye and the eye of Horus and these things. Analysis, separation, seeing functions is something that's essential in Egyptian culture, which goes against some of the negritude or negritudoid ideas that everything is feeling and sentiment. That's there, but there is also this analytical scientific tradition in Africa, and that African American students, I think, should be aware that blacks are not just good, it's not just that they can jump, they can think.
We have a wonderful movie here. It's called Islam and the Sciences, and it's not just about Islam, but it goes back to Egypt. And it'd be even worthwhile to show to mathematics students. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, thanks. I really think that...
On feminism, can I just...
feminism.
I'm very interested in relativity because Einstein wrote it, first papers with his wife. And I think the fact that he was marginal as a Jew outside academia was influential in the idea of relativity. But I think that she, as a Croat woman physicist, was even more marginal. And I think for women, the idea of relativity is even more easily. So I think there are feminist aspects to science in a very serious way that have been systematically neglected, particularly in physics. Even Fox Keller already showed quite ambitious agenda.
I actually think, as the last point, this is it, that actually I'm speaking from most scientists are not really trained or not educated in the history of science. Those of us who are begin to see these kinds of connections and do not make an argument for any kind of scientific ideas in science being developed at a point. It is actually a continuum. And I think that some of the things that I've read historically about particularly how one looks at things like motion, how one looks at the natural world, actually there is not a point of beginning where all of a sudden folk looked at them the way we do now. And I think that some of the things that are being discussed here will help us, I think, to see that it is not a point but a process.
A process, absolutely. There is a Professor Williams at MIT who is writing a history of dynamics, who's African American, and he's shown me the first chapter of his book, which is on Egyptian influences on dynamics. And I think that's something to keep an eye out for when it comes out.
Is that in MIT?
Yeah. So I think there is the beginnings of the literature. But meanwhile, Beatrice Lumpkin has written books for a lower level, for primary or secondary school on Egyptian mathematics, but I think that's useful. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, you mentioned mythology. This is my area. in terms of this historical mythology and how it's been postulated to galvanize African Americans around a central idea of a monolithic Africa. Similarly, I think Greece has been used as the same instrument to galvanize whites around this whole issue of civilization and what that's about. The whole Afrocentric approach, I think bears some mythology. Not mythology means something that's purely fictitious. I mean mythology in the sense that someone's describing something, a reality, in a multidimensional way that may involve some kind of imaginative way of describing something. So it's not something that necessarily is something that's a fictitious tale or something. So I want to know, in writing history and going back and looking at this kind of historical data, how can we kind of utilize the mythology in a way that I guess has its own kind of substantive weight, instead of always trying to say, well, this is empirical data. And since this is empirical, that means that my references are correct, and as you mentioned in the lecture hall there, I won't be criticized, or at least marginally anyway. So how can we deal with it? Because mythology is a real part of identification.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any pedagogic system involves, the myth of America, the myth of George Washington, the myth of Lincoln, all the rest of it, but there are various mythical stories built up. I was brought up on the myth of Britain, and somehow Britain never lost. I mean, just occasionally you switch sides in the history book and you join the Americans to fight the Hessians and various other people who weren't really English, So there's a myth in all history teaching, certainly at the pedagogical level, which is why I think it's so outrageous that suddenly Schlesinger and people like that denounce blacks and having history as therapy. I mean, history has always been, pedagogic history has always been therapy in that way. I mean, on Afrocentrism, I think it's difficult because there really are common African features. On the other hand, there's tremendous variety in African societies and change over time, so that it's it's not simple that there is an African this, which is pan-continental throughout time. Sure. On the other hand, there are certain common threads running. It's
unity and diversity.
But in terms of just using it politically as a piece to confront white hegemony, I mean, this is what it's used for, as how Hitler used the Aryan myth to almost rule the world. And throughout history also, again, the whole issue of black superiority, white superiority against black subservience. It was used to start slavery and to support slavery for 400 years.
Yeah. Which causes which is a difficult thing. I tend to be materialist enough to believe that slavery causes acute racism rather than the other way around. But I think they certainly go hand in hand and build each other up. But some myths seem to be too broad, and I feel uncomfortable with them, particularly the Iceman Sun People thing, that this genetic determinism that is built into that Bradley brings in. He's not an Afrocentric, or is white in Canada, but I think a number of people like Professor Jeffries have taken this up.
This is his other book.
That's his other book.
Yes. And here he says, and you're going to have to address it a little later on, the Hebrews as being related to Indo-Europeans and not Semitic. That's his argument. It's in there.
Yeah. Well, I'll read it, but I don't think, I'm not impressed by the first volume, so I think it's unlikely that I'll be impressed by the second. What do you mean by Semitic? Semitic is a language, it's a linguistic classification.
He deals with it as languages, yes. As a group of languages which were later borrowed by migrating Caucasians from the Caucasus area, and he relates them to being related to the Neanderthals, who, according to his argument, never completely died out. That's a myth, he said. It's not true. They never died out. And in fact, he used old Jewish scholarship from a rabbinical scholarship to make many of the points, and linguistics showing the root of Hebrew as an Indo-European language and being unrelated to what is called the Semitic language as a group.
I know enough about Semitic languages to find that absolutely incredible. I mean, the relationship between Hebrew and Arabic is really so evident. You can predict what the Arabic word from Hebrew or Arabic, the other way around. And as for Aramaic or even Amharic or the Guragi languages, there is a Semitic language family, and Hebrew is a member of that family, and that family comes from Africa. Now, what the people who spoke Hebrew looked like is another matter, and my feeling is they look Mediterranean, although there were clearly African blacks among them. But you get names like Pincus and Simeon, which indicate A, that there were people of African appearance there, and B, that they were relatively rare, in that it was used for a nickname, so that you do have a mixed population. But to say these are a pure white Caucasian people.
The Falashas?
Falashas are, Ethiopians look like anybody else.
You're looking at one?
Yeah, and it's so that Judaism is a religion that has spread to a whole number of different populations. And there were Ethiopians in Israel, we know that, from tradition.
It is the argument that Judaism is very recent. But look, as a teacher, I teach world civilization, and I use the Bernal text. What would you recommend? I use supplementary reading around it to break it down as keys, because my students have a difficult time, as most students here, with their text. What would you suggest as a supplementary reading, to go along with that text?
Well, I think I put the case pretty simply in the Journal of African Civilizations, which came out before. It came out in 85, 86.
You mean the article?
The article. That is more, it's got some technicalities in it too, but I think it is more accessible in the book, and and a 90-page introduction is no fun for students. So you have
Dr. Bernal, I'm just going to have to call a timeout. I know some faculty have to teach. Our teaching schedules are starting. So if those people that have to get up and teach, so that we... And then if anybody wants to continue the questions, of course you can, but I know...
Dr. Bernal, just one additional question. How many articles did you hand out to everybody? Because how many different numbers did you titles?
What I had.
Because I wanted to just collect one copy of every title so we can make Xerox copies so everybody who wants them can share them. So I don't know what the titles are.
So maybe when it's published, you have your name in it. That's
I don't want to extend
That's right. I mean, I'm sorry, I couldn't give you a credit. I don't think it isn't.
China and India and especially Mayan civilization, which are all Central America, because we're talking about world civilization.
Have you seen the cartoons?
Yes, I will show it in my class. Yes. But some of the students, they look at the cartoon and not looking behind. So you have to explain. Alright, get started by the cartoons and not behind the cartoons.
Who was that cartoon?
The couple for the book on Mayan. Central America, and as you can see, I have a bit of too.
No,
Yes, you want to give this an autograph? I told him when I see you, I'm not going to get an autograph. Because initially you said that forestry was going to be in science.
That really I said, which one want to bring up? I mean, I've done my general science. And then response is definitely not good.